From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, syndicating across the country on the Business Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC.com, and 1490 AM WGCH, Greenwich, Connecticut. This is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of JFK, the controversy that never goes away. Was it a lone gunman or a conspiracy that day in Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 1963? And for the first time in this format, we have the leading proponents, Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed on the Lone Gunman Side, and Lamar Waldron, author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination from the Conspiracy Side, debating the truth of the crime of the century today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Up first, Gerald Posner is an investigative journalist, also the author of Killing the Dream, James Earl Ray, and the Assassination of Martin Luther King. He's almost single-handedly debunked conspiracy theories. And again, that book was Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. We are taping here eerily on the exact day of the assassination, 50 years later, probably a couple of hours before the president was heading to Love Field in Dallas. Welcome, Gerald. How are you?
Very good, Jim. Thank you. Good to be with you.
2,000 books, 42 some plots, 213 people alleged in various conspiracy theories. 60% still believe, in fact, it was a conspiracy. Can you prove for us that Oswald fired the shots from the book depository using his Mannlicher Carcano rifle, killing JFK to the exclusion of all others?
Yeah, I can only do that, Jim, if I'm talking to people who are willing to look at credible evidence and approach it with some rational thinking and logic. I looked into this case when I first started, not thinking I was ever going to say Oswald did it alone, because I didn't think that's what it was. I was suspicious about the mob, which Lamar certainly will talk about in more detail. I was suspicious of them because of Jack Ruby's murder of Oswald 2 days later. But in the end, even though I would have loved to have come back to be able to talk to you and every other journalist around the country and say I have the incontrovertible proof that there was a conspiracy in the death of JFK, the overwhelming real evidence in this is that the simple answers are right, and that this 24-year-old sociopath, for his own warped motivations, ended Camelot 50 years ago today.
Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? I know you say that's key to understanding it.
It is key to understanding him. As a matter of fact, later when you talk to Lamar, you'll hear a lot about different people, but you won't hear much about Oswald, not at least in terms of his life, and that's because he's not key in a conspiracy theory often. He is key to me because by understanding him, you understand the why as to why Kennedy killed. And that's what the Warren Commission never delivered. They never explained to people why. They never told us why this kid who moved 21 times, 11 different schools, who New York psychiatrists examined when he was 13 and said he had schizoid features, passive-aggressive, explosive acting out. This man who went into the Marines and was thrown in the shower. They thought he was gay. He was twice, court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, went to Russia where he thought he'd be a hero. They told him to get out. He tried to kill himself. They gave him a psychiatric exam. They thought he wasn't right. Came back to America where he committed himself to political assassination and tried to kill a right-wing army general. And ends up in Dealey Plaza at a job at a Texas school book depository, and history drops right in his lap when the motorcade plans to come in front of that building. And this is somebody who would be ecstatic today that everybody knows his name.
Okay, talking about excluding others, etc. Let's see how you explain if he could do it. Did he have enough time to fire 3 shots? Was it a tough shot or easy with a scope? And there would have had to have been 4 shots for a conspiracy. And how can you tell us there were 3 shots he had time to fire and he could do the shot?
Well, the one thing I know without a doubt is that the only shots that hit the president that day in Dealey Plaza were fired from behind the motorcade, from the general vicinity of the 6th floor of the depository, where Oswald was left by 3 of his coworkers just half an hour before the president arrived. We know that they were fired from his gun that he purchased that February that he had used to try to kill Walker, to the exclusion of any other gun in the world. So whoever fired the shots that day, even if you want to say it was a world-class assassin, they used Oswald's gun. Is it an easy shot? No, it's very doable. And the Warren Commission got the sequence of shots wrong. They thought there was only 5.5 seconds. As I show in my book in Case Closed, there's at least 8.5 seconds. And new forensics and ballistics reports by Nova and PBS show over 11 seconds. But when I say it's not an easy shot, it's also not a hard shot. Look, people come up right next to a person and shoot him in the chest. Hinckley shot Reagan in the chest, and he didn't kill him. An inch and a half over, Reagan would be dead. Wallace was shot at close range. He didn't die. Sometimes you can be right on top of the target. And then other times it can be a rifle shot from a distance, and you can kill the person as James Earl Ray did with Martin Luther King. But remember, Oswald was a sharpshooter. He could, in the Marines and a marksman, he could hit a 10-inch target from 200 yards 8 times out of 10. He had a military rifle with a full-jacketed metal bullet. This was a good killing machine.
Interesting. I happened to ask him, an ex-Marine on Saturday night about the shot, and he said if it was under 200 yards, even without a scope, it's an easy shot, which kind of surprised me. Now, what about the grassy knoll? Everybody says in frame 313 that, and Oliver Stone made this, the worldwide, his head jerked back so that he had to have been shot from the front right.
Yeah, Oliver Stone, a great filmmaker, just a terrible, terrible historian. And I sometimes say that the only thing he got right in JFK was the date on which Kennedy was sent. It's virtually true. But it does look, when I first see the Zapruder film, when anybody watches it for the first time, you look at it, and it's like NCIS or Law and Order. We're used to somebody getting shot and they go over backwards. So you think, oh, Kennedy must have been shot from the front because his head goes violently back into the left. It's only today when you understand the ballistics and the medical forensics of it, and you see that film in slow motion, that you realize the frame before when the bullet strikes him, at frame 312, his head just starts to move forward an inch, and then in the next shot, there's a massive wound that blows out the right front of his head as that bullet enters from the rear, and that forces his body exactly where you expect it to, back into the left. I must say the key thing on the grassy knoll shooter is this. I just was in Las Vegas at the Mob Museum debating G. Robert Blakey, who I have the best respect for. He's the father of the RICO statute. He was the chief counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 70s. He believes that Oswald fired the 3 shots from the rear and killed the president. But he still believes that there was a grassy knoll shooter. That was the real assassin who was supposed to be there in case Oswald missed. And that assassin fired. And that's the real magic bullet, Jim, in Dealey Plaza. Those people believe that the front shooter fired. He not only missed the president, he missed Jackie, he missed the governor, he missed Mrs. Connolly, he missed the 2 Secret Service agents in the first part of the car, he missed the car, there was no bullet hole in it, he missed all the people on the other side. So somehow we are supposed to believe from the Select Committee that there was another shooter. That shooter fired, that was the real shooter, and that shooter never hit a person, and with no sound, no bullet ever found. It's just not real.
Okay, that gets me to the magic bullet. Supposedly it went up, down, left, right, and ended up, quote, pristine.
Yeah, there are a couple of things. First, the magic bullet, I always say, now needs no magic, and it used to be called the magic bullet theory. It was a theory when the Warren Commission gave it because they couldn't prove it. The FBI didn't know what to do with it. It was only 30 years later when I was first doing the hardcover for Case Closed that forensics people had figured out how that bullet happened, and that was that it went through those 2 men, hitting Kennedy first, didn't hit any bone, and then went on straight. By the way, no left turn, no right turn, no somersaults, no hesitation in midair, as Oliver Stone would have you believe. Goes straight into Governor Connolly, who's positioned in that, it goes through the governor, and does enough damage to the bullet that it's slowing up as it goes through the 2 men. It breaks the bones on Connolly in his rib and on his wrist, but it doesn't deform the bullet badly. And I've examined that bullet. I don't know if Lamar's gone, maybe he has, down to the National Archives. I've looked at it. And one of the fallacies is people say, oh, it's nearly pristine. Well, that's like saying nearly pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. It's either pristine or it's not. It's not a pristine bullet. It's a military bullet, 165 grains, full jacketed. I've examined it. It's pressed down on one side. It's pushed at the end. You can see where it hit and broke the bones. It's a damaged bullet in good condition, but that shot can be recreated ballistically day in and day out, and it is regularly for recreation.
And I think we'll talk later, 80% of its volume would have been slowed down by the end, which would explain the lack of more damage. Jack Ruby, earmarks of a classic mob hit to silence. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, Ruby, I'm so exasperated with Ruby because I'm furious with Oswald for having done this to history and having committed the assassination and being the murderer. I'm just as mad at Ruby for having ruined it for history because Ruby prevents us from having the trial, from hearing the evidence. If Oswald had been convicted, he either would have been executed, very likely executed, and if he had not been executed and had struck a deal to plead guilty as James Earl Ray had, he'd be 74 years old today, sitting in jail and saying, oh, I didn't do it, but few people would pay attention to him. Ruby made sure that never happened, and not because he was picked by the mob to go ahead and do it, but because Jack Ruby in his world, and I have a small biography about him as I have a biography about Oswald in Case Closed, Ruby thought that people were going to slap him on the back and say, Jack, you did the right thing. That little no-good SOB killed the president in Dallas, and you took the stain off the city today by killing him. Street justice. That's what he deserved. Everybody wanted it. But instead, people thought he had committed murder and tried him for it. He was stunned. We forget sometimes, Jim, that when the word spread onto the street, there were hundreds of people that had gathered to see Oswald transfer that morning in downtown Dallas near the police headquarters. When the word spread onto the street that Oswald had been shot before the ambulance came out, people broke spontaneously into applause. We don't think of that 50 years later, the amount of anger there was that weekend at the person then that people thought had killed the president.
Okay, Gerald, we have to go to the conspiracy side next. We'll continue. Lamar Waldron has been called the ultimate JFK historian. He was on this show for his book, Watergate, The Hidden History, Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA. New book, just out, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, the definitive account of the most controversial crime of the 20th century. Welcome back, Lamar. Good to have you here.
Great to be with you, Jim.
Okay, I call this the most credible conspiracy theory. Who had JFK killed, and how can you prove the conspiracy?
Well, there wasn't one government investigating committee. There were 6. So it wasn't the Warren Commission and the Magic Bullet wasn't the only one, as you would think from the news media or from Mr. Posner's work. There were 6. The 5th government official committee to investigate JFK's murder was the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It formed after a mob hit that dealt with the JFK assassination, in fact. And the House Select Committee officially concluded in 1979 that JFK was likely killed by a conspiracy, and they pointed the finger at 2 mafia godfathers, Carlos Marcello, who controlled the mafia in Louisiana and most of Texas, and Santo Trafficante, the godfather of Tampa, Florida. So the last official government conclusion was that it was a conspiracy, and they pointed at these 2 mob bosses. A lot of material was withheld from the House Select Committee, but more material came out in the 90s. The last government investigating committee was the JFK Assassination Records Review Board that was created by the 1992 JFK Act, passed unanimously by Congress. And that review board released the files showing that in 1985, the FBI had gotten Carlos Marcello's confession to having murdered JFK. And Marcello made that admission in the prison yard to his trusted cellmate, Jack Van Lanningham, and to another inmate he trusted. And what Marcello didn't know was Van Lanningham was an FBI informant. And there was a court-authorized bug in a transistor radio that Van Lanningham had in the prison cell. So that night, after Marcello's admission, that it's confirmed by Van Lanningham, the FBI supervisor, the FBI lead agent, 100 pages of uncensored files I got at the National Archives, that night Marcello warned Jack not to talk about what he had just said. That should be on tape. 2 days later, Jack got Marcello going again about how much he hated the Kennedys, and Marcello blurted out about his having met Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination, about how Marcello controlled Jack Ruby and Jack Ruby's nightclub. No surprise, because Marcello's organization controlled, the vice and sleazier clubs in Dallas. And Marcello even said he had imported 2 hitmen from Europe to do the actual shooting. Now, that's while the FBI undercover tapes are rolling. We don't have those tapes. They should have been released. They haven't been. But like I say, we've got the FBI informant, the lead agent, and the FBI supervisor, and 100 pages of the uncensored file. So the House Select Committee on Assassinations was right. And I've spent 25 years looking at this case. And I tried to include information in my newest book that would show that Oswald was a shooter. But what your listeners also may not realize, the House Select Committee found out that Naval and Marine Intelligence had done their own investigation of Oswald after the shooting. The House Select Committee was not able to get a copy of that report, though they were able to prove that it existed and that it questioned the Warren Commission findings, but they were stonewalled by the Defense Department until the committee's mandate expired. I basically picked up with what the House Select Committee had done and where they had been stonewalled. That was one of the big areas. So I tracked down an investigator who had been part of that secret investigation. And he said, yeah, we did this investigation. it concluded two things. And by the way, he's only talking to me through an intermediary because his secrecy oath for he and all the other investigators has never been rescinded, still in force. And he said, we reached two official conclusions, and this is why the Navy would not give that report to the House Select Committee. He said the report concluded Oswald was incapable of doing the actual shooting, and he was incapable of masterminding the assassination. That doesn't leave much role for Oswald. What Gerald left out was, marksman is the lowest of three levels of shooting in the Marines, and Oswald, in his last test, scored barely above the minimum. More than that, we know from Oswald's fellow Marines that when Oswald was in the Marines and practicing, unlike when he was in Texas, and there's no evidence he ever practiced, even when he was in the Marines and practicing, he was not a great shot, and in fact, sometimes he would not just miss the bullseye, he would miss the entire target. So Oswald was not a great shot. The last time I checked, no marksman has ever been able to duplicate Oswald's feat on the first try with a moving target. When CBS tried to recreate the situation with a stationary target, with these people who really were top sharpshooters, none of them could do it on the first try with a stationary target. So with a moving target, 1 in a million, it just didn't happen. The mob hired, real hitmen to do the job. Oswald was set up to take the fall. We know from earlier FBI informants, Marcello and his associate in crime, Godfather Santo Trafficante, had been planning this crime for more than a year. And basically, Oswald was set up to take the fall because he was a low-level intelligence asset for U.S. intelligence, one of many we were trying to get into Cuba in preparation for a coup that JFK was working on with the head of the Cuban army, the number 3 man in Cuba. It was set for 10 days after Dallas. That's why there was so much government secrecy. It's because just a year after that tense nuclear standoff at the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were getting ready to take some action against Cuba if JFK's 2 secret back-channel peace negotiations had not worked, and they were kind of stalled at the time. So that's why there was so much government secrecy. That's why Bobby Kennedy controlled JFK's autopsy. And again, things you'll never hear in Posner's work at all is JFK, as it turned out, was almost killed in Tampa, Florida, 4 days before Dallas in his motorcade there, and in Chicago 3 weeks before Dallas, when JFK had to cancel not just his motorcade, but his entire trip at the last minute because 2 gunmen were at large. So the mob had one plan to kill JFK, shooting from a high building at the motorcade with a high-powered rifle, and it was tried in 3 cities, Chicago, because Johnny Roselli, the mafia don of the Chicago Mafia for Las Vegas and Hollywood, he confessed to his attorney shortly before he died. And then Tampa, Florida, Santo Trafficante confessed to his attorney shortly before he died. His attorney was a lot more involved than he ever let on. And then we know now that the FBI has had Carlos Marcello's confession since 1985, but they were covering it up back when I got started on this back in 88 for the 25th anniversary, and they're still withholding the tapes. So we should be able to hear Marcello's own words. I talked to the one FBI agent who heard every one of those tapes. He said there was no sign of any kind of senility or anything on Marcello's part because this was a 2-year operation by the FBI, and they would never have continued that if Marcello had been, senile or anything. So he was 75, but he was mentally alert. Jack Van Lanningham, his cellmate. Okay,
you're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell, the Business Talk Radio coming next, debating lone gunman versus conspiracy. Our guest, Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed, and Lamar Waldron, author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. In this segment, we're going to debate the JFK assassination on the ballistic side of the equation. So I want to start with Lamar. And all the evidence, and the ballistic evidence, does point to the shots coming from behind and above. And
actually,
that's
actually not true.
Okay, Lamar, hold on 1 second, my man. I want to set the stage here, okay?
Oh, okay.
Because I was talking to a Secret Service guy when we were not on the air, and they have a different take than the Warren Commission, which is interesting, which is that there were 3 shots fired, which is what everybody says, and I'll let you go, but that all 3 shots hit, that one did not miss, one hit Kennedy and the throat one, and one hit. The second one hit Connolly separately. And the third one, I want to describe what he said. A glancing blow to the skull on the lower right side forced a piece of bone about the size of your palm into the brain. The projectile then continued slapping the skin that had covered the bone to the front side around to the forehead. The bullet trajected onward, never found. No exit wound, therefore the bullet never entered the skull. And if the shot was from the grassy knoll, there would have been an exit wound. And so go ahead now.
Who said this?
This is one of the Secret Service guys. It's the Clint Hill, Jerry Blaine. And Clint Hill was, as you know, the one that jumped on the car.
Well, I don't even know if Gerald would go for that. But what I was going to say was all of the ballistic evidence does not point to the shots from the back. I mean, when you look at JFK's body, all of the doctors who saw the wound in the front of JFK's throat said it was an entrance wound, because generally a bullet will have a small entrance wound and a larger exit wound. Also, the whole magic bullet thing is simply a physical impossibility. Any of your listeners can prove this for yourself. Sit a man in a chair, okay? The back wound, and it was not a back-to-neck wound, it was a back wound, was almost 6 inches from the top of the collar. All the evidence shows that. JFK's shirt, JFK's coat, and the autopsy diagram all show, and it was actually measured, it's almost 6 inches from the top of the collar. Make a mark there. Now look at the gentleman's Adam's apple, because the small entrance wound was just below the Adam's apple. The problem with the magic bullet theory, the reason it's simply impossible, is when you have a bullet going at any downward trajectory and it's hitting you in the back, 6 inches down from the top of your collar, that is lower than the Adam's apple. So it's simply impossible for that bullet to hit at a downward trajectory in your back, then 6 inches below the top of your collar, somehow go up, come out your Adam's apple, and this is what Oliver Stone says, for that to work, it has to pirouette in midair and then dive down again. So that's simply a physical impossibility. Anybody can set a man in a chair, prove it for themselves.
Gerald, what about that question about the trajectory too low?
Yeah.
And secondly, the shot hasn't been replicated with cadavers, but talk about the velocity issues.
Yeah, but even before talking about the velocity, there's something very important. In the beginning of the show, you said that 60%, 66%, I think, in a recent Gallup poll, still think it's a conspiracy. That's a big drop down from the 85% after the Stone film in 91. 30% think it's a lone assassin. That number's gone up from 5% after the Stone film. But it's little wonder to me that most people think it's a conspiracy, because if you listen to someone like Lamar Waldron, he's very intelligent, he's very bright, he's done a prodigious amount of research, and he says things as though they are facts. And if somebody listened to Lamar and didn't know the evidence, they would absolutely leave from listening to a conversation with him as though that was real. And a perfect example is talking about the magic bullet being a physical impossibility. I think when you hear him locked into a position like that, when ballistics and forensics have advanced beyond him, when the science has passed beyond that, and even hardcore conspiracy theorists now acknowledge that that shot happened as the Warren Commission originally thought, it makes you question some of the other evidence, such as the fact when he says it's the bullet entrance is 6 inches below the collar, so therefore the bullet wasn't traveling on the right trajectory from top to bottom. That was disproven back in 1964 because Kennedy's suit, there are pictures of it from the Zapruder film and from other films, show that his suit was bunched up. He was sitting on it. He had a back brace on. His suit and his shirt were both bunched up. The bullet hole, you can't push it and look at it and say, oh, it's 6 inches down from the collar. You have to look at it where it was when he was wearing it, which is exactly on the trajectory it would go through for the magic bullet. And that's an old canard that's just getting recycled here. In terms of the bullet slowing up, it does get fired at 2,100 feet a second, about the same as an AK-47. It hits Kennedy at about 1,500 to 1,600 feet. When it hits Governor Connolly, it's tumbling. We know that because the wound on his back's 1.25 inches long. That's the exact length of the bullet. It hits him sideways. And when it hits the rib, it's about 900 feet a second. It hits it on the side. That's enough to shatter the rib. Just push the bullet down a little bit. And by the time it hits that wrist, it's moving fast enough to break the bone, not fast enough to deform the bullet. I'll tell you, Lamar could say that you had a world-class mafia assassin shooting that gun from behind. That's fine, but the one thing you have to say for history is that that so-called magic bullet happened that day as it did.
Okay, let me ask you this, Lamar. Jack Ruby, set up to silence Lee Harvey Oswald. The fact is, Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to be moved at 10 a.m. Ruby was in bed then. He was down wiring money to a stripper, which was time-stamped 11/17. Oswald was shot at 11:20. He left his dog in the car, and if Oswald also delayed 5 minutes asking for a sweater, it sounds very impulsive to me.
Well, what you have to realize is Jack Ruby had been stalking Oswald since Friday. And so on Friday, there's a news conference with Oswald, and he's pulled in front of all the reporters, and one of the Dallas officials makes a mistake in saying which group Oswald was involved in, and a man calls out from the back of the room, no, it was this other group, and that man, and you can see him on TV footage of that, was Jack Ruby, and we know Jack Ruby admitted he was packing a gun that night, and he tried to force his way into a room, an interrogation room. So Ruby was stalking Oswald since that night, and he does another weird thing on Friday night and Saturday night in terms of a parking garage, in terms of getting a stamp, and so he was clearly responsible for either getting a Dallas policeman to do that hit or not. As I point out in the book, there were plenty of ways that Ruby could have and did get into that basement. He had assistance. The House Select Committee on Assassinations looked into that, and they fingered the actual Dallas cop who refused, by the way, to testify or take a lie detector test, who helped Ruby get into that. So as I outline in the book, there are myriad ways that Ruby could have easily been signaled on the exact timing. And plus, Ruby didn't have to go to Western Union to wire that strip of the money. That's clearly a cover story, and the Mafia gets away with murder because they do employ cover stories, and they know how to do this. Because he had enough money in his safe at work that was next to that parking garage, he could have gone and gotten her the money at that time, but he didn't. So he was trying to create an alibi. And I lay out very clearly in the book, that he had help getting in. Here's exactly how he got in. And like I say, the House Select Committee, they fingered the actual Dallas cop, who was fairly corrupt.
Jim. Okay, Gerald, jump in. Go ahead.
Jim, you just listen to this. This is so fantastic. Lamar says that the mob was ready to kill him. We had Oswald-type patsy set up in Tampa and in Chicago, and then it didn't happen. Now we've got Oswald here in Dallas. We've pulled off a conspiracy with dozens and dozens and dozens of people involved. Carlos Marcello used to say a conspiracy is 2 or more people, and it only stays a secret if one of them is dead. But here we've got dozens, and no one's talking. Oswald has to be killed because obviously he knows something, even if it's just bringing the rifle into work. So what happens? Ruby is called up and told, because no one kills Oswald when he's leaving the book depository. Everyone forgets in the plot to take care of the assassin, the patsy. No one kills him on that day. So they have to call up Jack Ruby and say, Jack, biggest assignment of your life. Go down there. You got to kill this guy Oswald. The entire plot with dozens of people. We've just killed the president. Ruby goes down, and Lamar just says he has his gun with him. There's a video that shows that Oswald walks a few feet away from Ruby on Friday night, and Jack must have said, yeah, you know what? I don't feel like it tonight. On Saturday, he was back at police headquarters with his gun again, and Oswald was taken out in the hallway twice past Ruby. No attempt to do anything. So what is this, sort of a lackadaisical hit? I'll do it when I'm in the mood to do it? It belies logic to think that it was anything other than this moment in which the two of them came together on Sunday by complete fate and coincidence, and Ruby, in fact, then ends up killing Oswald.
Jim, can I respond to what Gerald?
Yeah, we got about a minute. Go.
Well, again, there weren't dozens of people involved. There were at most, I'd say, between 10 and 12. These were all experienced Mafia people. We know that 5 of them later confessed. So again, you had one plan, 3 cities, not 3 different plans. And also, as far as Ruby and Oswald and everything like that, again, Jack was supposed to get a cop to do the killing. I'm sure he kept hoping he would do that. Instead, he just simply had to do it himself. So this was not a gigantic conspiracy. It was a small, tightly held conspiracy by people that have been getting away with murder for decades, and that's exactly what they did here.
Okay, well, we'll go on and listen to the next segment, and I still have a mystery as to there were never any other shots beyond the 3 shots. The 3 shots could have been fired in 8 seconds. They did come from behind, but the House Select Committee did say it had the earmarks of a mob hit. I'll say one other thing. I got to meet Rabbi Hillel Silverman, who was Ruby's rabbi and used to visit him in prison very frequently. He ended up coming out to our hometown into Greenwich, where he was in the temple here. And I asked him about it, and he told me that he thought Ruby was just crazy. So
and he was right. I interviewed him as well as all the doctors at Parkland who I interviewed, who, by the way, when Lamar said they thought there was a front shot, he omits one thing, and he's too smart. He knows this.
They didn't turn him
over.
over.
Doctors at Parkland never turned Kennedy over. You know that, Lamar. He was on a stretcher. They never turned him over. They never saw the...
All right, well, final segment, gentlemen. Final segment coming up. The final segment is coming up. Stay with us.
Gerald, don't try to say...
Our guest leading proponents on either side of the JFK assassination debate, Gerald Posner. In the Oswald acting alone camp, Lamar Waldron, a mob conspiracy, had JFK killed. I want to start with you, Gerald. Are there links between this fair play for Cuba, where Oswald in New Orleans, particularly with the address 544 Camp Street, that appeared to be the same that some of the folks that Lamar would say are involved, was there links, and what about this Patsy argument?
It's the most significantly investigated part of the assassination. Jim Garrison, the district attorney down in New Orleans, who turns out to be an absolute fraud. If he had lived long enough, he probably would have been charged finally by prosecutors for prosecutorial misconduct, for, we now know, knowingly going after innocent men because he thought the ends justified the means. Garrison, absolutely disgraced, and of course becomes Kevin Costner in the film by JFK. That's been looked at, the House Select Committee. I talked to Blakey, who was the chief investigator, and they ended up finding nothing there at 544 Camp Street, the so-called address that was so big. Here's the key part, and I think this is important. Here's where Lamar and I have a gulf that's hard to overcome. Forget the individual facts about the shooting, about the bullet, about ballistics. He talks about the mob hating Kennedy. I agree. He talks about the mob planning to kill Kennedy. I wouldn't be surprised if you could produce a videotape of a group of mobsters sitting around a table in New Orleans or in Tampa or in Chicago saying, let's get that no-good SOB, meaning JFK. And if they had taken steps to actually go ahead and kill him, I wouldn't be surprised as well. At any given time, against a U.S. president, there's some plot probably brewing. Today, against Obama, you could have anti-abortionists, you could have Islamic fundamentalists, you could have white supremacists. Against Kennedy, I'm sure anti-Castro Cubans who thought he was a traitor were also involved with their own plots. My point's always been that when Oswald comes back from Mexico City in early October of '63, for the first time he knows that Kennedy's coming to Texas, somebody's got to bring him into the plot. They can't do it like science fiction. It can't be done telepathically. There has to be a telephone call. There has to be a meeting with somebody. He's living with a group of 6 other guys in a rooming house, and that's where the failure is, to show that Oswald was doing it for the mob. He beat the mafia to Kennedy. They would have pinned a medal on him. They would have clapped him on the back. All of the evidence that Lamar finds about the mafia, about Marcello boasting years later, about Trafficante confessing to it, we've had more than 24 people, Jim, confess to the murder. The best thing a mobster can do years later in the 80s is like Marcello say, Kennedy? Yeah, I whacked him. It's the best thing for your street credentials.
Can I answer this? Because Gerald's good about kind of getting off the question. Let's go back to your 544 Camp Street, because it addresses exactly what Gerald brought up. When the House Subcommittee on Assassinations looked into that, sure, that building housed the offices of Guy Bannister, an extreme anti-communist, super right-wing guy who was Marcello's private detective in 1963. He was the former chief FBI agent of Chicago who had a drinking problem, but he still had a lot of intelligence connections, according to the New Orleans newspapers. And so that was his building, that Oswald has had address of this right-wing guy stamped there. But there's more than that. Also working with Guy Bannister and Oswald that summer was David Ferry. And Richard Helms' own assistant, Vincent Marchetti, later said that David Ferry was a CIA agent at that time. So what we now know is the House Select Committee was able to find several people. In fact, a grand total by the late 90s, there were 6 people who put Oswald, the supposed anti-communist, who avoided real American communists like the plague, was not associating with American communists. Oswald was working for and with and seen by more than half a dozen witnesses in the summer of '63 with Guy Bannister and David Ferry, these rabid right-wing anti-communist guys who were both working for Carlos Marcello. And in fact, David Ferry spent the 2 weekends before the assassination with Carlos Marcello at his Churchill Farms estate. Marcello and Ferry both confirmed that. Now we know the 2 shooters were there. So when Gerald says there was no time Oswald was brought into the assassination, I'm saying, yeah, throughout that summer, Oswald is being seen by witnesses with these 2 guys who are both working for Carlos Marcello. At the same time, they're working for U.S. intelligence. So that's how Oswald was brought into the plot.
Okay, we're down to 3 minutes. Tell us, Gerald, what was Oswald doing in Mexico, and what about the fact that the FBI and the CIA didn't give all the evidence to the Warren Commission? James Halstead.
To deal with that, Jim, I just have to say one thing.
Okay.
It's not that Lamar's right on 1 or 2 of those things. There's not an iota of credible evidence to support what he just said. I feel like I just had a time travel machine take me back to 1969 or 1970 when these theories were still going around about the Clinton witnesses and Oswald having some connection to Ferry or Bannister. I demolish those witnesses because they're absolutely lying. They've concocted the stories. They're not true. I show the inconsistencies in Case Closed. Maybe Lamar hasn't looked at those, but I will tell you that if he's relying upon those late 20-year stories about Oswald somehow having a connection with those two.
Hey, I'm going with House Select Committee investigators, Gerald, and information that they found and testimony that they got. And you ignored most of that testimony. Don't bring up Clinton. I don't bring up the Clinton thing in my book. You bring that up because the Camp Street witnesses are there, and they're valid.
But okay. We're not obviously going to agree with it, but I will tell you that I would like to have an hour just to talk to you about the supposed Ferry and Bannister connection, because you think that Ferry and Bannister are connected to Oswald. Before anybody knows that the president's even going down to Dallas, then it says a lot
Gerald,
about...
I have a solution for you. We can solve this once and for all. Carlos Marcello said on FBI undercover tape that David Ferry was the man who brought Oswald to meet him. Why don't you join me in the effort I've got at the White House petition to get those tapes released?
I'll be happy,
and we can
Lamar. I've
this.
always thought the worst thing the government does is hold on to these files. It's what Jim just said a moment ago about Mexico City. But I have a question for you, Lamar, if I can ask you a question. When did the Mafia bring Ruth Payne into the plot?
The Mafia did not have to have Ruth Payne in any sort of a plot. I have never said anything remotely
suggesting that. She found the job
that.
for Oswald, though.
The book depository.
I'm sorry, what was that again?
She found the job
for Oswald at the book depository. So you mean to tell me she wasn't part of the plot?
1 minute, guys.
I don't think she was part of the plot. Oswald was looking for jobs, and you know this, Gerald. There was the map of Dallas. Oswald was looking for a job somewhere in downtown Dallas. I would propose that he had been told by Ferry or Bannister to get a job somewhere in downtown Dallas, because that motorcade route was going to go through downtown Dallas. So if it hadn't been the book depository, it would have been one of the other places on the map.
The entire assassination...
Oswald had marked these places where he was going to try and find a job. And in
fact, Lamar, you're telling me that the entire assassination for the President of the United States by the Mafia was based upon Oswald finding a job in downtown Dallas, and if he didn't, it wasn't going to happen?
Okay, I'm going to stop. Guys, I got to stop you right there. I got to stop you. I got to stop you right there, gentlemen. Well, I got to stop you right there. We got to finish this segment. Then we have an overtime segment. Please, everybody, stay with us. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell on the Business Talk Radio Network. Thanks to Gerald Posner, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the assassination of JFK. Lamar Waldron, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, the definitive account of the most controversial crime of the 20th century. And if you're listening on Yale Radio, WYBC, stay with us as we will go into overtime, and we will let Gerald and Lamar go at it again in a deeper 20-minute look. Thanks again to the leading proponents. The first time this has ever been done in this format, Lamar Waldron, Gerald Posner. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. This is Segment 5, Overtime, exclusively for Yale Radio. We've been talking with the leading advocates on each side of the debate. From the lone gunman side, Gerald Posner. From the conspiracy side, Lamar Waldron. And I'm going to lead off, by the way, by saying I think you're both right. I think Oswald acted alone, as Gerald Posner said, but I think the Mafia was planning a conspiracy. Oswald beat them to it. Okay, my first question here is Lee Harvey Oswald's escape. Both of you tell me, where was he heading? What was he planning to do? Did he even expect to get out of the Texas Book Depository? And short answers?
Well, from my perspective, Oswald was in the lunchroom where witnesses place him, and there are two witnesses. He couldn't have been coming down that stairwell from the so-called sixth floor sniper's desk. He was near a payphone waiting to make or receive a call. We know from John Martino, a CIA asset, admitted CIA asset, CIA admits that in 1963, who was also working for Santo Trafficante, Oswald was supposed to meet his contact at the Texas Theater. We know from a Warren Commission memo that was not published in their report, Oswald had just enough money to make it down to Mexico City. And so it appears from all evidence he expected to leave work that day, head to Mexico City, try again to get into Cuba, and he was supposed to meet his contact at the Texas Theater. So when he leaves work that day, he goes to his rooming house. A police car pulls out up in front of his rooming house, beeps the horn. Oswald doesn't go out. That police car pulls away. Oswald then goes out with his pistol, and he is shot approximately halfway between his rooming house and Ruby's apartment. But I think he was headed to the Texas School Book Depository, but there is so much conflicting evidence about the Tippit shooting. The Warren Commission called their own lead witness in that, pretty much crazy. And some witnesses saw two shooters, some saw a car drive away. So I freely admit in the book, Oswald may well have shot Tippit, but there's a lot of evidence that he may not have shot Tippit as well. And he may have already been in the theater, according to the concession guy.
Okay, Gerald, let me get your side. And I continue to find it that if Oswald was not involved or didn't shoot, why he would have shot Tippit on a Friday afternoon. But go ahead, Gerald.
All right. The thing is that's key is, again, Lamar, who has some interesting research and information in his book, continues to recycle and regurgitate what I call the old information. He's got Oswald in the lunchroom because he feels compelled to somehow exonerate Oswald and show that he wasn't really the shooter. Do you know what that's based on? That's based on the statement that Anthony Summers got 15 years, a writer, 15 years after the assassination from Carolyn Arnold, a secretary of the depository's vice president, who said, "Oh, I saw Oswald in the lunchroom at the time of the assassination." And guess what? Go to her original FBI statements. She doesn't see him at all. The four women who were with her watching the motorcade said it's not true. He wasn't in the lunchroom. He was up on the 6th floor shooting. John Martino, who's quoted here as a CIA asset who said he was going to meet Oswald, is a guy who's looking for his 15 minutes of fame and has been totally discredited by the House Select Committee.
No, the House Select Committee did not just discredit Martino at all. Martino did not say he was meeting Oswald. He said Oswald was to meet his contact. House Select Committee took Martino extremely seriously.
There's no but not about saying he was going to meet Oswald.
No, not to meet Oswald.
Right.
Martino said Oswald would meet his contact. Right. Martino was in Miami at the time. And here's Martino was part of the plot.
So let's assume that Oswald's a patsy. If he's a patsy, Jim, and I think Lamar would agree with that, a true patsy, they're not going to do anything to Oswald in the conspiracy because it's like a 900-pound train hitting him. He's going to get run over, not know what happened to him. He's going to get convicted in a court of law. He's going to go away for the rest of his life and be sitting there twiddling his thumbs.
I don't agree with anything Gerald is saying. I would agree with that. I don't agree with anything Gerald
Lamar,
said.
I just let you say what you thought Oswald was going to Mexico City. If I could just get this in about what I think he was doing. When he left the depository, which he got on a bus, and a former landlady of his saw him and said she told police he looked like a maniac. He got off the bus because it was too slow and took the first taxi he ever took in his life because he was very, very cheap and had very little money, to go near the rooming house and collects his pistol and a jacket. No evidence whatsoever that a police car pulled up and honked the horn. That's a canard told time and time again.
His landlady said that.
And he stopped, by the way, by a policeman, J.D. Tippit, who died today. We forget about that. We talk about him as though he's some cardboard figure. He was also killed. His family and wife went on to live without him. He stopped him based upon an all-points bulletin put out by a witness who saw the man in the 6th floor of the depository pull the rifle back. Young 20s, brown hair, male, white. And when he pulled Oswald over, within 30 seconds, Oswald shoots him 4 times at point-blank range, ends up in the Texas Theater, Lamar, not because he's going to meet a CIA contact from the X-Files, but because he ducks in there when police cars are going by, and he's being followed by another guy from a shoe store who thinks that he looks suspicious, and they see him duck in there without paying for it, trying to hide from the police cars for a while before he gets arrested.
Now, Gerald just misquoted the description. The description they issued in Tampa for the assailant did match Oswald very closely. The description issued in Dallas was for a guy 30, 160 pounds, so older and heavier than Oswald, and we now know it was not based on this so-called eyewitness identification. Professor Gerald McKnight, a tenured historian, proved that. So, like I say, there are a lot of questions about Tippit, and I admit Oswald may have killed Tippit, but I think, like I say, Oswald's landlady, you can choose not to believe her, she's the one who was there. She said the cop car pulled up, blowed the horn, Oswald did not go out. Only after the cop car pulled away did Oswald go out. I think by that time, Oswald fully knew that something bad had happened, that he wasn't just going to Mexico that day. The president had been killed. He knew he had been building this cover, this deep cover for years that would make him look incredibly guilty.
Okay, let me ask this.
When he is confronted by a policeman, like I say, I don't rule out that Oswald may well have killed Tippit, but there's a lot of evidence that he didn't kill Tippit, and in fact that he may well have been in the theater.
What evidence exists? When you say a lot of evidence, that's what you just said. A lot of evidence exists that he did not kill Tippit. What is the lot of evidence?
Well, number one, the concession guy says he was in the theater. And we have to remember, when he went in the theater, when he was arrested, Oswald had half a box top. When Oswald went into the theater, he didn't go take a seat. He went in, sat down next to one individual, waited, got up, went in, and then sat next to another individual, as if waiting for them to produce the other half of this box top, got up, and then moved to see it again. And then when we look at the evidence at the actual Tippett scene, like I say, several witnesses saw two people. Other witnesses saw a man shoot Tippett and get into a car and then drive away. And then even the ballistics evidence. Now, this is weird, Jim. So like I say, Oswald may well have shot Tippett, but oddly enough, after shooting him, and he may have done that in a panic, I don't rule it out, he takes the time, instead of running away, because you know when you shoot a cop, you need to run, right? The killer stopped and emptied his revolver so that there were shells on the ground, but there's a problem. The shells on the ground don't exactly match the bullets from Oswald's rifle. From Oswald's pistol. So,
that's not true.
You know, there's an attempt made.
Lamar, that's just not true. You can't say it as though it's true and think that if you say it, it's true. It's not.
Tell me what I just said that's not true.
That there were shells on the ground that did not match.
Okay, I'll read it right out of my book. 2 of the shells were made by Remington Peters, 2 by Winchester Western. This is right out of the Warren report. However, of the 4 bullets taken from Tippett's body, 1 was Remington Peters, and 3 were made by Winchester.
He had a mixed lot. But wait, Lamar, here's the question. I asked you a moment ago, what was the significant evidence? What was, as you said, the big evidence that Oswald did not shoot Tippett?
And like I said, there are witnesses. You can read them. You're familiar with these witness statements. You can read them in my book.
But you said he was in the Texas theater. Somebody had seen him.
Well, the concession guy said Oswald was in the Texas theater at the time of the Tippett shooting.
That's right. So do you agree that when he was arrested, he had the pistol that was later tied ballistically to killing Tippett?
He had his pistol, and I can say that those shells, that's very suspicious to me. That's what I'll say there.
All right, well, I'm going to stop you there because I don't want to. We can't do Tippett the whole time, but that was a good point that Gerald made at the end there. Gerald, answer me this: the House Select Committee.
Can't agree on
okay, one thing: the House Select Committee ended up saying, with a 95% degree of confidence, there was this 4th shot from the grassy knoll. Gerald, can you talk about that?
What's that? I'm sorry, I missed that.
The House Select Committee ended up saying there was a 95% probability that there was that 4th shot from the grassy knoll off that dicta belt that heard the sounds in Dealey Plaza. Can you comment?
Yeah, I think the Select Committee did some tremendous work. They debunked a lot of former conspiracy stories that were leading up, but they stumbled. They made a big stumble near the end of their investigation. They relied on an audio tape that they thought at the time was on a police motorcycle at Dealey Plaza, and they think, if it's on a police motorcycle at Dealey, we probably can hear the shots. And then when they play it, here's what you hear, Jim. Sorry for dead time on the radio. What you hear is nothing, because there isn't anything. But they said, okay, let's get some sound experts in here. And the sound experts said, guess what? We can see some subsonic spikes at these spots, 4 of them. And we think this is when the assassination took place. So the Select Committee was closing up its work. They said 95% certain those are bullet shots. That has been debunked since then, especially because we now know that sound tape was not on a motorcycle at Dealey Plaza. It was actually over the Trade Mart. You can hear the bell in the background. There's no siren sounds of the police going along with the motorcade to Parkland Hospital. Has none of the sounds that it should have. They were listening to the wrong tape, wrong place, wrong time.
Gerald, Lamar, before you answer, I want to add a piece to that. If you look at pictures from above, the grassy knoll is completely open parking lot, and I find it very tough to believe that there could be people holding rifles or guns and things like that who could have gotten away or unseen.
Well, first let me answer on the acoustics evidence. Gerald and I may almost agree here. I don't use the acoustics evidence at all. I'm not a scientist. My background is psychology, particularly adolescent psychology. My degrees are in psychology. I'm not a scientist. I leave that to the scientists. There are scientists that say there's validity there. There are scientists that say there's not. But when something is that contested, I don't put it in my book. I look for things that have independent corroboration, like Marcello's statements that are backed by a mountain of evidence. So Gerald, I will agree the acoustics evidence may not hold up, which is why I don't use it, and why G. Robert Blakey, the director of the House Committee on Assassinations, said that their conspiracy conclusion was not dependent on that acoustics evidence. So they had plenty of evidence of a conspiracy beyond that. So I don't even go there. And then, Jim, I will ask you to repeat your question.
The question being that if you look at the grassy knoll, there doesn't seem to be any way that you could have had people with guns behind there without being seen or getting away. I'll also say that there's a picture now that Jerry Blaine told me, and Clint actually, that the minute that Kennedy's hit, the two Secret Service guys on the left of the car behind are looking exactly up at the Texas Book Depository and, giving credence to shots coming from behind. But how do you think stuff could have happened on the grassy knoll and not have been seen?
Well, and we should point out, people didn't run to the Texas School Book Depository after the shooting stopped. They ran toward the grassy knoll, and I mean most of the law enforcement. Only one law enforcement guy went to the depository. Everybody else, all the other law enforcement, were running to the grassy knoll because that's where people thought the shots came from. And so when you look at it the way it was then, you can see it in pictures. There were a lot of trees there. There was a lot of shade, and there were people that did see, gunmen back there. There was Lee Bowers in the railroad tower back behind there that saw, two suspicious men there, and he said he saw what appeared to him, to be, some sort of a flash, whether it was a glint of a gun barrel or whatever. We also know there were no Secret Service agents on the ground at all, period, in Dealey Plaza. Everybody agrees with that. However, there was a fake Secret Service agent on the grassy knoll warning people away before the assassination and even after, who was encountered by witnesses, including a Dallas deputy and a Dallas policeman, saw this Secret Service guy. He produced Secret Service credentials. Now, that guy very likely could have been one of the shooters or watching over the shooters. We have to remember, too, the cars were never searched that left the parking lot there. So you could have had somebody in the trunk of one of those cars, or they could have just literally walked away, because there were also fake Secret Service agents encountered by police behind the Texas School Book Depository. So as far as what happened to the real shooters in the depository, they could have well been those fake Secret Service agents, behind the book depository, because there were no real Secret Service agents on the ground in Dallas. So again, to me, that's just much more evidence of a conspiracy.
I agree with Lamar that there were no Secret Service agents on the ground. I disagree with him that there were fake Secret Service agents running around. I discussed it at length inside Case Closed. He knows that. I talk about the individuals that saw them after the shooting and how they got confused with other federal agents with badges, and I go down that list. But more importantly, you listen to Lamar, he has a lot of could have. Maybe there were fake Secret Service agents in the Texas School Book Depository. Maybe they were the ones who got out in the back. The would have, maybe. They weren't cloaked in invisibility. Abraham Zapruder was on a 4-foot concrete pedestal. The grassy knoll was to the right of him. His secretary who was with him looked out over that area. If a shooter had been taking place and a shot had been fired next to them, not only would they have heard it, they did not, but in addition, they would have been looking right on top of that shooter. Never happened.
And Gerald knows Abraham Zapruder, as far as the direction of the shot, said it came from behind him, where that grassy knoll shot was. So Abraham Zapruder is a good witness.
Well, that would be in front of him.
He supports my view of things.
No, that would be in front of him.
And we also know, and Gerald knows this, JFK's two closest aides were in the car right behind John F. Kennedy's. They had the perfect view of JFK's head, of the grassy knoll, Dave Powers, Kenny O'Donnell, and they both said, and were forced to change their testimony, but then they later admitted it to Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House. They said at least the first shot and the horrible fatal headshot came from the front. Even one of the Secret Service agents in the car with them, even after the official story had come out, lone nut, magic bullet, no conspiracy, that Secret Service agent said, yeah, at least one of those shots did come from the grassy knoll. So, again, even under all that pressure, that brave Secret Service agent
I understand that. You're absolutely right. There are certain areas we come to common ground here. That the FBI and the CIA had a cover-up after the assassination will differ as to the reasons why. You'll think it's part of a conspiracy. I think it's to cover their bureaucratic behind. That agents and others were pressured. The chief agent in Dallas of the FBI destroyed evidence at Oswald's note. So there's all types of things in here that make me just want to scream. But what's key is you cannot, as a good investigator, and you are in some areas a good investigator, but you know this, you can't just rely on somebody's ear witness that says, oh, I think it happened over here, if it goes against the absolute
which again, the Dallas doctors who saw JFK's throat wound all described it as a wound of entrance.
Have you interviewed them?
No, but they made their public statement, so I don't have. Did you get them to recant that? No.
No, the key thing they say is, we said that because we never turned him over.
Well, they said it because of the size. It was a small entrance wound, and that wound was smaller than the back wound.
That's right. No, not smaller. They never turned him over. How could they say it was smaller than the back wound? They never saw it.
I'm saying they described it as an entrance wound because it was small, and we now know that it was smaller than the back wound.
No. Why do you say it was smaller than the back wound? Nobody saw both wounds. The doctors at Bethesda didn't see the front wound.
Wait. You're overlooking the fact there was a doctor who was at Bethesda and at Parkland, and you know who that doctor was, don't you?
But they had already.
Wait, don't you know who that doctor was? And he believes in a conspiracy. He believed in a conspiracy. That was JFK's personal physician. Admiral Berkeley was the only doctor in Dallas and at Bethesda. And he wasn't in the surgical room. He is on record as having believed in a conspiracy.
Right. But my point is, how can you say? You just say it as though it's a fact that the back wound was smaller. How can you say that? It's just not true. You can't say that.
Well, I can say it because the autopsy doctor poked his finger in the back wound. There was a picture of the back wound, and it is smaller than the way the tiny wound of entrance in the throat was described by pretty precise measurements by the doctors in Dallas.
No, wait a minute. The treating doctors at Parkland were trying to save his life. They weren't doing a forensics exam. They weren't measuring bullet holes.
These were guys who were used to handling bullet wounds at Parkland. That's where people brought when there were bullet wounds in Parkland, and they were used to that. I mean, that was their first inclination. This was an entrance wound.
But they never think that's right. But if they had seen the back wound, they would have realized the bullet had gone straight through.
As we're not talking about here, when the autopsy doctors saw that same wound, and Gerald and I both agree that there was a throat wound there, a tracheotomy incision was made. Okay, we'll agree there. But when the autopsy doctors at Bethesda saw that tracheotomy wound, they didn't realize there was a bullet.
That's right.
The huge, jagged things, a couple of times, or 2 or 3 times bigger than that tracheotomy incision in Dallas. In other words, somebody had enlarged that incision before the official autopsy started at Bethesda, and the pictures verify that.
Do you endorse David Lifton's theory, who wrote Best Evidence, that there was surgery on the president's corpse done between Dallas and Bethesda to make it look?
I support the significant amount of evidence that shows that there was a quick, hurried national security autopsy with a few people before the official autopsy began, and there's an awful lot of evidence that I show in my book about the timing of when the autopsy started and who was there that supports that. And again, somebody, Gerald, enlarged that tracheotomy incision because it's clear from the photograph someone did, and I will let you explain to your audience, to the audience right now, who enlarged that tracheotomy incision.
That national security autopsy, by the way, then did you think some surgery or some altercation?
Wait, I just asked you a question about the throat wound, and you're not answering.
I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
When did that tracheotomy incision get doubled in size and turned into a huge gaping wound?
That's the amazing thing is,
when did it happen, Gerald? I'd like to know your view on that.
It never happened. The tracheotomy was done.
So the picture of this huge, gaping, ragged wound that's vastly different from what the Dallas doctors did, that photograph doesn't exist?
Yeah, it does exist, but I don't understand.
Well, yes, who enlarged that? Gerald?
One question. The comparison photograph that you use from the Parkland doctors, which photograph do you use from the Parkland doctors of the tracheotomy they did? What photograph are you relying on to compare it to?
I'm relying on their testimony.
No,
they made that incision, and they said how big it was. And everybody saw the tracheotomy incision.
They're ER doctors. They're not forensics pathologists. You're relying on testimony and then looking at a photograph and saying it must be different.
Small tracheotomy incision. These are not hack doctors. No doctor in his right mind would make the huge gaping throat wound that is visible in the autopsy photo.
Listen, to the listeners of this show, Lamar thinks there was a national security autopsy that somehow altered the president because he thinks, based upon the testimony of the treating physicians at Parkland who had never had anything like this in their life, the president of the United States was dying on their table or was already dead.
But they had plenty of gunshot wounds and tracheotomy.
It must have been altered. It's wild stuff.
But Gerald, you have not told the audience who hugely enlarged that horrible gaping throat wound.
That's the point. The doctors at Parkland were wrong on any number of recollections.
So you're saying the doctors in Dallas, instead of making the small, neat tracheotomy incision that everybody saw, instead they did this horrible, huge gaping wound that nobody in Dallas saw, and yet is on the autopsy photo?
You know that Dr. Perry never even knew that the president had a head wound, and he was treating him? And all that massive blood and everything else, he never even
You're
realized he had a
ignoring.
pet
You're
wolf?
ignoring again, like you ignore the impossibility of the magic bullet. You're ignoring this huge gaping, horrible,
Lamar,
jagged wound in his
let me
throat
ask you a
that's
question.
visible
Lamar,
in the
can I ask you one question?
autopsy photo.
Earlier, you said that there were 10 to 12 people at most involved in the conspiracy that you saw. Is the secret autopsy team, they're part of the conspiracy, right?
No, they're part of the cover-up. Bobby Kennedy was part of the cover-up. People were trying to prevent World War III. The official autopsy would have to be entered into evidence at Oswald's trial. There were huge national security implications. People wanted to prevent World War III, and that's why I believe somebody opened up that wound, that tracheotomy incision, looking to see if there was perhaps a bullet or to see if they could get any more information before the official autopsy began.
How many people were involved in the cover-up?
I'm sorry, run that by me again?
How many people do you think were involved in the national security aspects of the cover-up?
Well, I mean, when you look
100?
at the people who withheld evidence from the Warren Commission, you tell me how many people withheld crucial evidence from the Warren Commission.
It sounds to me as though you're saying
dozens and dozens, and you would have to admit that, right, Gerald?
That's the
Richard Helms withheld evidence.
Dozens.
CIA Director John McCone withheld evidence. Lyndon Johnson withheld evidence. So lots of people withheld evidence from the Warren Commission. The House Select Committee determined that.
That's right, but you believe they withheld evidence as part of an actual cover-up of a murder.
Yeah.
No, to prevent World War III, the best reason
knowing that there was a murder.
And Gerald, you still haven't told the audience about this Tampa assassination attempt. I did not travel back in time and plant that one newspaper article
I understand that.
appeared the day after
Lamar.
JFK died that put that in there. I did, the Dallas chief, the Tampa chief of police, described that attempt. He said he thought the Warren Commission would talk to him. He thought you would talk to him. Nobody wanted to talk to him because no one wanted to hear JFK was almost killed in Tampa, Florida.
Okay, I'm going to stop, guys. I got to stop you right there. I got to stop you right there. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.